basically post-Ruby McCullum that we talked about last month, from 1952 on to Hurricane Dora, which was 1964. So we start out with Dr. Price Day, 1953. The county and the city of Live Oak declared Dr. Marvin Price Day, or Joshua Marvin, J.M. Price, because he was a longtime physician here. He'd been serving here at 50 years by this point. So basically, let's celebrate, let's have a day of celebration. There was a parade, there was ribbon cutting, and all those kinds of things because he'd been here serving the people for 50 years. So it was a big deal at the time. Now this we have talked about in prior presentations. In World War II, basically the citizens of Suwannee County wanted to memorialize those who were serving in the war, and so a memorial board was constructed at the Suwannee County Courthouse on the grounds of that. And it had a list of all the known veterans of the war. So that lasted for a few years, but then after the war ended, things came and went, people got busy, and it became more of an eyesore. And so what the county and the city would do was they eventually just painted over the names of all those veterans, and they used it kind of like an advertising board. But then beyond that, it was like, you know what, we're tired of it. So as you can see here, they just painted over it and left it blank for a little while, and then eventually they just decided to tear it down. But they kept talking about what to do and not, but eventually they decided, let's just tear it down because it's unlike what it looks like. It looks like it's marble or something like that, but it's really just plaster and wood. So it was starting to get in bad shape, even with the paint jobs, and so they just decided to tear it down. Of course, now we've got Veterans Memorial Park that's got a lot of the names of those who died, but this is the one who had all those that served in World War II. So just times change. Other thing going on as we get to the 1950s, this was good for those of us who grew up out in the country. Modernization, things like electricity were expanded to all of Suwannee County. No longer was it situated just in Live Oak and Branford, but all of us county dwelling folks were able to get electricity for the first time. A power plant, this power plant was built close to Ellaville, cost $6 million, and it was built in the 1950s. My great-grandfather helped to build it, and he was one of the first foremen there. And then as he retired, my grandfather was put in his place basically, and he served there. He retired there after 30 years. So, plus my aunt worked there lots of summers. I've got lots of family that worked there at that power plant. But it was finally shut down in 2016 because we had solar power. This was coal, you know, bad, people thought. And so it was old. It was time to stop using it. Solar power and nuclear power down south and other places were being used instead. So they shut it down, and then a couple years later, they imploded the building, tore it down, and there's basically nothing there now other than the nearby solar farms. But that was there at Ellaville. And in conjunction with this construction here and the allowance of more power running in the area, Suwannee Valley Electric was able to get out and help a lot of the rural families for the first time get electricity. The house I grew up in until I was in high school, my parents built a newer house, was one of those old houses, didn't have, originally, by the time I was there, it had electricity, but you know, the outhouses and all that stuff. The bathroom was an add-on to the house I grew up in. So that was something during the 1950s. Also, as we get into all these post-World War II eras of expansion and such, there were also some low housing units, low income housing units that were built in Live Oak. They were constructed off Duval Street, close to the old fairgrounds, which is now John Hill Park. That area, just on the, I guess it would be the north side and the east side of that. They were constructed for those who could not otherwise afford homes, and some of those are still there actually today. As we continue in the 1950s, the North Florida Telephone Company was sold to Otto Wettstein and his son, Otto Wettstein III, and that actually was the old Florida Telephone Corporation, but they renamed it the North Florida Telephone Company. and that expanded into rural areas. So if you lived in the country of Suwannee County, the country area, in the 1950s, you were living high on the hog by the end of that decade, because not only do you have now electricity and running water, things like that, you've got telephone service. So things were moving up for Suwannee County. Here's a picture of one of the old switchboards that were used by the North Florida Telephone Company, which later became Alltel, which later became Windstream, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these switchboards we still have at the museum today. We've got a display of several of them set up, and you can actually go in there, especially the kids can go in there, and you can play with it. You can ring up some of the phones in the building and whatnot, so kids like to play with it. You know, plug it in stuff, bunch of numbers, and you can hear all the mechanisms going and clicking and all that stuff in the back when you've got it on, so that's kind of funny to have. Other things going on. Again, lots of expansion post-war. You've got a major building expansion. We'll see that as we go through this presentation. You've got roads being built, and you've got buildings being constructed. So one of the buildings, which still exists today, is the Coliseum. That was constructed in the 1950s. It was completed in 1955. This is as they're starting to put some of the first girders on. I've actually got some of the bond paperwork still at the clerk's office to help pay for this public project. But it was constructed in the 1950s, completed in 1955. And it's funny how I'm doing this, because just yesterday I was having a discussion with somebody from the county offices for the upcoming minutes, and she had spelled Coliseum, the C-O-L-O-S-S-E-U-M, like the Coliseum over in Rome. And so I was saying, well, I think it's Coliseum the way I've got it spelled up here. And she said, no, I think it's the other way. That's how it's spelled there. And I had never really noticed it, but it's spelled the old way, the C-O-L-O-S-S-E-U-M. And then I had this like, all right, that made me dig into some history. And apparently it was in the 60s and 70s where everybody started switching to calling it or spelling it C-O-L-I-S-E-U-M in general. And the other one is just the big one in Rome that everybody thinks about when they think of the Coliseum. So drive by and just look, and okay, interesting. I mean, we always spell it in our records the new way, so to speak. All right, road work. There had been a lot of debate around the town of Live Oak. There were a lot of truckers especially that were very concerned with the route that US 90 at the time took, because it was a down, up, forth, left, right, back and forth. And I'll show you in a minute. I put a map in here to show you the route. It was lots of ups and downs, and when you start driving semis through downtown Live Oak, it became a nuisance, especially at the time before they widened the roads, and it was basically a two-lane highway all the way through both areas, north and south, 129 and 90. And so there were lots of complaints. So for several years, the state DOT was trying to figure out a plan to adjust the route. And the holdup, the main holdup anyway, for the records, was that originally DOT did not want to go through downtown Live Oak. They wanted to kind of skirt around what we know as downtown Live Oak. And the county and the city said, no, you've got to go through downtown Live Oak to help all those businesses. So eventually, as we get up into 1955, the state agrees, we'll use Howard Street as the basis for Highway 90 and go from there. And everybody was okay with that pretty much. And so the construction began. This is a picture of it after it began, and that's the old First Baptist Church right there in the background. So that shows you where it is on the west side of town. So doing this was going to eliminate several terms, and yesterday I decided it'd be easier just to show it to you than try to describe it to you. And so the red was how 90 used to be. So you go down, over, up, over, down, over. It was convoluted. And actually, when I had first started the clerk's office, I was 20, 21, I guess 20 when I started. And I was doing some research, and I saw some pictures about some business that was on US 90. And this was prior to the 1950s. And I was looking at that picture, and the building still existed, and it's like, that is not on US 90. And then as I started studying, it's like, old US 90, when it was on the old route, because it was on we call it Ohio Avenue today, or 129 today. But that threw me off until I realized, okay, that's the route. So they switched from that red route that you see to the green route. A whole lot easier. Truckers especially loved it, and downtown loved it because you still had access to those downtown businesses. So big difference there. Big difference. Now the funny thing is, before the early 1900s, the old state road, which later became US 90 and the federal road, pretty much followed the green route also. It followed Howard to an extent, sometimes Connor Street way back when, which was the street between Howard and the railroad. But basically, Howard Street, most of it had been the original state road through town anyway, more or less. And what happened was, by the early 1900s, when automobiles first were being mass produced, folks like B.W. Helvenston decided, you know what, as you get over here to the east side of Live Oak, where like the Brown Lantern is today now, there were a lot of sawmills, ice plants, power plants, all that stuff. It was like our main industrial section of town. And so B.W. Helvenston and others decided, you know what, I don't want folks driving through Live Oak and seeing all that mess and all that noise. So let's give them a more scenic residential route to travel through. And that's when they turned it down Ohio Avenue and down Helvenston Street, which was created basically for that purpose, park. And so that was how it was for 50 years. But then by the 1950s, all those power plants, sawmills, all that stuff that was over here, they were gone. And so you now have lots of semis wanting to get through, making it very difficult to turn down here at where Hardee's is today. And so they make this change. Here's a picture of it where it's almost finished in downtown Live Oak. Now, because of that relocation and some of the adjustments of the road, there are some businesses that need to move, or they decide to move. And so as soon as this, or as this is being completed, you've got a lot of new businesses coming in or moving. So here's just a few of them. The old station. That one actually is there by City Hall today. And several other gas stations especially that put themselves along that new route that were not there before that. Well, once US 90 is done, the state and other governments decide, let's work on US 129. Now, US 129 is not near as bad off. I didn't put a map in here because it's not near as bad as US 90. But there are some changes that need to be made. And let me back up. Should have already said this, but let me back up. If you've been around here long enough, do you remember the old hospital, where it was located? The old Ford Memorial College, which was way before me, but it was, at that time, it was on Highway 90, and the old hospital was on Highway 90. So me growing up, born in the late 70s, I wondered why it was, a block off of the main road. Well, because that was the main road when it was built. So you had to see several businesses that move. Anyway, going back to 129, they decided to make those same changes. And so they started working on it, especially, most of the changes happen north of the railroad tracks, because up until this change in the 1950s, which it's completed in 1957, up until that point, US 129, once you got to about Duval Street, you actually had to turn a block east and then go up Hamilton Avenue. And then Hamilton Avenue was the one that went to Hamilton County. That's the name. But that was the old 129. So they basically just straightened that portion as it is today. But the other thing they did was they widened the road. So it went from a 2-lane road with lots of trees on either side, live oak trees, to what we have today, that 4-lane with parking, parallel parking. And so you lose a lot of those beautiful trees that we had had since the foundation of live oak. This is a picture of it on South Ohio Avenue once it's complete. A lot easier to drive through. Again, semis, much easier than having to do all these turns on these small city streets. They've got a 4-lane highway to go through downtown Live Oak. Again, it was completed in 1957, but the worst part was we lost a lot of those live oak trees in the pictures I've shown you in previous presentations. And I've shown you downtown Live Oak and just south of downtown Live Oak, all those beautiful trees. They had to cut them down. But that's progress. But just like when 90 was straightened, when 129 was more or less straightened, there were a few businesses that came in, most of them on the north side of the tracks, because that's where the majority of the changes were made. So here's a couple of the buildings, gas station, the old beverage building that were constructed on 129 north after the changes that were completed in 57. So lots of things, so much growth, not just here in Suwannee County, but also over the entire country. But not only are the roads being changed and rebuilt, not only are other buildings being constructed, but then you've got a lot of school changes. Our schools are continuing to consolidate gradually, but one of the things they built in 1953, as all these other changes are going on with US 90, and then later on 129, you've got all of Suwannee County's, the Live Oak schools anyway, are all together clumped in the downtown area, close behind the courthouse, between courthouse and First Baptist basically, is where the schools are. And in 1953, they built this cafeteria, which still exists. It's now the quarterback club and where the football players go before the game. This building allows students, for the first time in Live Oak's history, to be able to go to a cafeteria and eat lunch. They don't have to go home, which a lot of them could because they live close, or bring their bag lunch. Now they can go to the cafeteria, sit down, and have a hot meal. The meals started at 20 cents. I wish it was still 20 cents for meals today. And they got a half pint of local milk also. So that's a picture of the outside and a picture of it on the inside. Not too much after it was constructed. But there are other school changes going on. So I was telling you about the clumping of the schools in one area in Live Oak, and this picture here, this shows pretty much the schools. You've got the football field, at the time it was called Reeves Field, but you've got football field, you've got the Nettie Basin School, you've got the high school, the junior high school, which that used to be the high school before they built that one anyway. So you've got pretty much all of these schools, first grade through 12th, in this area around the football field. But they need more space, they need more classrooms. Again, especially as they are starting to consolidate more and more of these country schools. They're getting rid of the one-room schools, the one-school teachers that we talked about a couple months ago. And so in 1954, they are about to start beginning construction of a new elementary school. They're going to call it Pineview Elementary School. Oh, there's the cafeteria right there, the new cafeteria. So they start construction of a few different schools, not just for the white folks, but for the African American folks. One of them being the Douglas School. Now this is the third Douglas school that I know of. They were in a couple different locations on the south side of Houston Street. Not too far from here, to be honest. I mean, Houston Street would be here, and the old Douglas High and Douglas schools were down over here. So they're still, white and black schools in Live Oak are all within about a half a mile of each other. But there needs to be as especially the black schools are consolidating into 2 or 3 different locations, they need a new school. So they build a new Douglas High School, later Douglas School, and it is built off Ontario Avenue, where there's a lot more space to build. And they start off with the main part here, kind of in phases. They build this part here. The gym is built in the 1960s, which is the only part really that's left at this point of the school, that and the EOC. But they construct this, and it begins, and of course it was torn down just a few years ago in bad shape. So while that's going on, they're working on those. They're working on that new elementary school, that Pineview Elementary School, and here is a drawing of it. They look at different locations to build that school, and eventually they settle on Pinewood Way. Let's build it on Pinewood Way or Pinewood Drive, whatever it's called then, Pinewood. And so they start construction of it in 1956. It would not remain an elementary school for too long, because after Hurricane Dora hits, we'll talk more about that in a minute, they actually start using it as the high school. So that is the basis. The Pineview Elementary School is the foundation and the base for what is now Suwannee High School, expanded and such. But that is the gist of, or the basis of Suwannee High. So here is the construction of it in 1956 as they're working on it. And when I went to school there, that's what it looked like. Now my senior year, they did a lot of renovations and such. I wasn't there for it. I was off at college, so I missed all the nice part. I had the yucky 50-year-old or 40-year-old part of the school at that point. So I'd come back to visit my friends who were still in high school, and it's like, wow, this nice new big library. Then I spent a lot of time at the old one, and all these nice buildings, and I had the junky stuff when I was there. But, you know, it is what it is, progress. So that's it under construction. I'd rub it in because I was doing a 4-day college school week, and my friends who were my age were still in 5 days per week. That was fun. All right, Beulah. Not Bueller, but Beulah. Hugh Lewis became sheriff in 1953. Just after all the Rudy McCullum stuff. He ran for office and was elected sheriff, and he served for a few terms, but he had a prize bloodhound named Beulah. And from 1948, when actually before he was even a sheriff, he was working for the road guard and some of the state, basically in the law enforcement section of that. But from 1948 until 1955, Beulah, his dog, became famous for tracking down fugitives. Like his prize dog. Wonderful dog. She was good. She was good. And you would read the newspapers as you go through the late 1940s and 1950s. You read about Beulah's got another one. She's caught another one. She was famous. I mean, like nationwide famous. People from all over the country had heard of this dog. She would track for many, many hours, so long that she couldn't even jump over fences, and so they would carry her. But she was still following that track. She could even do it when people would like jump in ponds and lakes and stuff. She'd be able to track them. I remember one of the stories that you read about in the newspapers. They were tracking an armed fugitive, and he opened up fire. And so she basically laid low. She ducked and laid low out of the way until the gunfight was over. Then she went and found his body, because I think he'd been killed in the exchange of fire. So she still tracked him down, but she was famous for that. She had 64 confirmed captures, but that's not the total. That's just when they started tracking, which was not the first few years. So over about a 2 or 3 year period, she tracked 64 and found 64 fugitives. So it didn't include the first few years, nor did it include the children, the missing children that she was able to find. So people were calling up Sheriff Lewis from the entire state and this region saying, hey, can you bring Beulah to help track? I mean, sometimes these would go on for 2 days of tracking people, and she would follow their scent. I think there was one time that she didn't get them because they got in the vehicle and drove off. Okay, she's not perfect. None of us would be able to do it anyway. But she was good. When she died in 1955, her death, Sheriff Lewis took it hard. He found out while he was in court, and he cried. He was upset. He was upset. He was very visibly upset because she'd gotten, I think, an infection in her paw, if I remember correctly, and they thought she was doing better, but then she took a turn for the worse and died. But he was upset. We learned about it, and the death of Beulah made national newspapers. I mean, how often does that happen? So, very well-known dog. One of my books I wrote, Lost Suwannee County, there's a chapter just on Beulah. So, I mean, you know, lots of stuff on it. I don't see it up here. But she was a famous dog. But this was the late 40s and 1950s. She was tracking. And then actually, she had a litter of puppies. One of them, I think, was named Judy. And one of the last things I saw when I stopped doing the research years ago was Judy was now following in her mom's footsteps. So she was tracking people pretty much as well as her mom did. So interesting stuff. All right, well, when you're not a fugitive, you want to find something else to do. Suwannee County and Live Oak in particular needed more recreational activities. And so in 1955, the city and the county jointly bought the old Dexter Estate, which had become the old fairgrounds before the Coliseum was built. And they originally talked about renovating the old Dexter home, which was a huge home. It was bigger than the Dowling house that still exists. So get an idea of how big the house might have been. It was huge. He was probably the richest man of Suwannee County at the time, which was the late 1800s and extremely early 1900s. He had a huge house not only for himself, but he built one next door for his daughter, which was of equal size, and it had lots of property. But the Dexter Estate, after his daughter Ruby passed away, Ruby Dexter Hable passed away, the property was purchased by the city and the county, and they, again, wanted to renovate the house, but it was just too old, dilapidated, so they tore it down. In 1958, they constructed this building there at the Recreation Center. Was there for many years. That was the Recreation Center for Live Oak. Up until the mid-90s, when the county and the city bought property on the south side of Walker Street, and it's now the Sportsplex. That became the new recreational center because they had a lot more space there. And plus the neighborhood was not as good here at the old rec center. Just didn't have as many opportunities. As a kid, that's where I went, was the old rec center. I remember going in there and watching Thriller. That's when I watched Thriller. Was sitting in there one night, they had some kind of get together for the kids. And that was, what, 40 years ago now? Still remember it. But that was the rec center. And now it's called John Hill Park. And they've got more limited facilities, but they are still there for the area. Skate park, and used to have racquetball courts there. I stayed away from those because things went on back there. But it's still there. That building was constructed in 1958. You can see one of the old houses over to the right, the one that was not Dexter's. That should be the old White House, I believe. Swanee River Jamboree. Other recreational activities. If you liked country music, which I guess a lot of people did back then, you probably wanted to attend or listen to the Swanee River Jamboree. It was started in 1952 by Norm Protzman, who kind of ran WNER, the radio station at the time. And it became North Florida's largest and best known country music show. Several decades it continued on, various facets of life. It was performed every year. They had local stars and they had country stars. They normally performed them over at those tobacco warehouses, which was off 2nd Street, off between basically around Walker Street and 2nd Street. None of those exist today, but that's where they normally held them. So it went on for many, many decades. Lots of people. This kid down here was pretty famous. I forget his name because I don't like country music, but he was famous for the day. Let's put it that way. Yeah, lots of folks played here. I would say that the country jam at Spirit of the Suwannee is the spiritual successor to this. They kind of picked up where this left off. So it was a big deal. Lots of people came. Not quite as big as Spirit of the Suwannee is today with their festivals, but a lot of people came and listened to the music and would hear it on the radio. That's Norm Protzman in the 1980s. And then we get back to construction. We've already talked about US 90, we've talked about US 129, we've talked about some schools. Well, we've got other road work that is beginning. You've got the Itchtuckney Road that connects Branford to Lake City Highway. And then you've got a new bridge over Dowling Park. This bridge was built about, well, the picture was done in 1913. It was completed not too long before that. And so for 40 years, that was the Dowling Park Bridge, but it outlives its usefulness. It was old. It was that part of that first era or first period of railroad bridge construction. And while some places had been replaced in the 30s and the 40s, places like 129 Bridge and even Lurville Bridge, the Dowling Park one was not replaced until the 1950s. And so that's one of the things that worked out. So they replaced that bridge. And then recently, within the last couple of years, they've replaced that bridge. So that really is the fourth period of bridge building in Suwannee County. So you've got the early 1900s, then you've got like the late 20s and the 30s, maybe into the 40s for that second era. And then you've got the 60s, 70s, early 80s for that third generation. And now we have started, I guess I would consider the fourth generation of vehicle bridge building here in Suwannee County. The LOP, Live Oak Herring Gulf, I'll get it right. Railroad bridge is right there. And speaking of that one, the 1950s sees the end of the LOP&G as a passenger service here in Suwannee County. It is purchased by the Georgia Southern and Florida Railway Company. And so they basically more or less stopped the passenger service that ran through Live Oak for 50 years. This is the same railroad that football players and fans would go to Perry. They just take the railroad, just ride the LOP&G over to Perry, things like that. So they shut it down for passenger service. They rename it, rebrand it. It becomes basically just a cargo carrier. They close portions of the railroad. And so it actually still exists today as a subunit, a subunit, a subunit. Places like, I think the Florida Georgia RailNet was one of the names that it's under now, but the LOP&G as we knew it anyway, ended in the 1950s. Kerry Hardin, who had become governor of Florida in 1920, he passes away in November of 1957. Age of 81. Picture on the left is basically his governor's portrait over in Tallahassee. And on the right, that's him in 1956, just a year before he died, at, I believe, Stephen Foster Memorial. So he was a very instrumental man, not just in politics, but as a lawyer, as a businessman. He was big into banks. He owned a few banks, ran a few banks, lots of different stuff over the years. And we've talked about him before, but he did die in 1957. Same year that happens, we've got something called the Boys Ranch. And what happens is in August of 57, the Florida Sheriff's Association calls for at least 160 acres of land near some body of water, and they want to do it to use it for troubled and abandoned boys. Pretty much what had happened was some sheriffs had gone over to Texas to go chase a convict, and they see this program that Texas has instituted about these boys. And so they decide, that's a good idea, let's see if we can find a place over in Florida. So they start working it out, and eventually a local politician and businessman by the name of Thomas Musgrove, who's really, really distant kin, okay? It's not like a direct ancestor of mine, but My great-grandfather's cousin kind of thing. The rich side, we're the poor side, that was the rich side. He donated 160 acres of land by the Suwannee River. And by 1958, the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch is accepting its first boys from the state. After that 160 acres, an additional 562 acres are purchased. So, a rather large area for kids to be able to be helped and trained. So this is one of the early groups showing up and celebrating. Fundraiser, I'm sure, was involved too. But one of those who donated, one of the original patrons, was none other than a guy you might have heard of named Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was in one of his movies, and he donated the cottage that was used in it. So this is him donating that house, that cottage, in the Boys Ranch, which is still there today. Somewhere I've got a listing of who half these folks are. I don't remember now. I think one of the boys on the bottom is Hugh Lewis's son, one of the sons, but I could be wrong. But anyway, he donates, a lot of other folks donate. Gradually, the facilities expand, so now there's a gym, there's a school, there's a church, there's businesses that the kids can, or the boys can learn how to be better people. And so it's a great program. I grew up right close to it. I went there several times visiting and spending some time there, not as one of the troubled boys, but visiting people that were there and family and friends and that kind of stuff that were helping there. Because of that success, they then established a girls ranch and then a youth villa, which was for siblings, like boys and girls that were their siblings. So we've got those three things going today. That's a famous picture of it at the entrance of it. That's Jim Strayer there on the right. I'm not sure who the boy is. I love driving down the entrance. I don't know if y'all been there, but it's beautiful. I haven't been there since the hurricane. It might not be as beautiful, but up until Idalia, it was beautiful. Just to drive down that line driveway, it's very peaceful. Drive back there sometimes. Just families drive around sometimes, and we try to go out that way sometimes. It's nice, very peaceful. Something that affects where we are today. The year of 1958 saw the regional library system being established in January specifically. And what it was Suwannee and Lafayette counties decided to pool their resources to have kind of a joint library system. Instead of Lafayette County being responsible for their own, Suwannee for our own, they decided to pool their resources, their administrative powers and whatnot. And so they established the Suwannee River Regional Library System. Well, by the end of that year, we've got other places that are involved. We've got Madison, Gilchrist, Hamilton, Taylor, and Columbia County. So it becomes very quickly a 7-county regional library. It's actually the first in the state to do that. And this helps rural counties such as ours to be able to provide better services than what an individual library could provide. And so it continues on today. We've only got 3 counties, and it's been like that for decades, as other ones have moved on. But they share administrative needs and administrative cost. So here's the headquarters here in Live Oak where we are today. But you've got all these outlying libraries, Branford, Dowling Park, just in Suwannee County. Plus Madison's got a couple, 2 or 3. 3. Greenville now? Okay. And then Hamilton's got 3. So all under the same umbrella. Each county provides funding for their own libraries, but the administrative things again are shared. So it works out best. You've got a better system than individually you can have. And that is the old library behind the courthouse in the 1960s after this 2-story portion was completed. The 1-story portion over here was built in 1948. We talked about that a couple months ago, I believe. But that was the library, that was the one I grew up going to. until they built this one the year I graduated. In 1958, February specifically, saw us have a cold spell, and we had 2 inches of snowfall in Suwannee County. Not something that happens very often. I remember in 1989 it happened, and it was not 2 inches. It was barely enough to cover the ground. You can make a snowball, but it was more of a dirt ball with a little bit of snow on it. And it hurt when you got hit with it, because it was, again, mainly dirt. And then I guess more recently than that, it did it briefly. But this was 2 inches. It covered the ground. And so the newspaper, the next couple of editions of it, showed lots of photographs, especially around Live Oak, of where the snow had fallen. These are 2 pictures of the courthouse, and you see several workers of not just the clerk's office, but you've got bailiffs there, you've got a tax assessor, I believe, is there, Hub Gray there on the right, on the left-hand side of the right picture. Several of the workers there. On the right hand is Curtis Harold, who was a jailer for the sheriff's office. He actually was my great uncle also. Let's see, Francis Skipper is there, Geraldine Marable, Helen Cribbs. So lots of folks there, but lots of snow. Here's some more pictures showing Live Oak. There was enough snow to actually build a snowman, as they've got sunny Florida in the background. So lots of snow. And that middle top picture shows it, I guess, as it's coming down. So, a good bit of snow for just a day or two. Not long. Well, by 1958, we need a new armory. The one at the time that was in use had been constructed in the late 1930s. Actually, I've got a picture, I think you can see part of it. I should have just put a picture in here, but I did not. There's part of it right here, you can barely see. It's a 2-story building, but it is in downtown Live Oak. And it is getting difficult for our National Guardsmen to use it, especially when you take into account that we were now a tank unit. So there's a picture I did not put in here, but there's a picture of them bringing in 2 M47 tanks and then having to park right there at the Armory, downtown Armory. I mean, you got 2 tanks sitting there by the schools, basically. Might be an issue. I mean, I would have loved it. I would have loved to have been around it. But it was an issue, so they decided, no, we need to have more space, get a bigger building, a newer building. And so in 1958, they decided to build off New Bern Road, which is now County Road 136, on part of the Coliseum complex area. And so they construct it. They name it after a longtime member of the Florida National Guard from our unit, Louis Wadsworth, who later becomes General Louis Wadsworth in charge of the entire Florida National Guard. And so they build that armory, which still exists today. And it's got an M4 Sherman in the front now, which is an older tank, but don't get me started on that. So we still use it today. So that was basically the drawing of it, and it pretty much looks like that today. Not much has changed. We're no longer a tank unit. We weren't a tank unit that long. Mainly have been infantry over the years, but for the last, 30 years, 40 years, we've been an engineering unit. 1958 also sees the Centennial, 100 years since Suwannee County was established on December 21st, 1858. So there is a big deal. I can only hope our 150th would be close to this in big deal. They did stuff pretty much off and on for the entire year. It was a year of celebration. They had a week-long big deal in October, I believe, is when they actually did most of it, because December would have been hard with the holidays and such. But they had parades. They had who has the best beard. They had a huge community play, all kinds of good stuff. So, so much so that the county actually the county commissioners put out a book or a booklet and a book about the Centennial. So you read about the different things, and E.K. Hamilton, who was the historian for the county, basically then, he helped write up a play of the different eras of Suwannee County's history. So it's kind of fun to read through that and see what they talked about and see some of the names. I've got relatives in there and people that I know. And, it was a big deal. I think the governor actually showed up too, dressed in 1850s garb, as these bells are dressed up also. Different counties showed up. There's one from Lafayette County. Those pictures are both taken in front of the Swanee Hotel, which was across the street from the courthouse. So it was a big deal. It was a big deal. Very nice. Like I said, it went along pretty much all year long with different things. Not just here in Live Oak, but also other places, like down in Branford. This is one of the things they did, was had a cattle drive down in Branford. So the River Riding Club was herding cattle through downtown Branford. So just remembering the history. Of course, I'm a historian, so I'm a little biased towards it, but it seems like this kind of stuff is not taught like it should be. In 2008, we didn't really have much going on for our 150th. I wrote a book, but I mean, there wasn't that big of a deal, so we've lost a lot of it. Maybe our 200 will be better. Granted, we probably won't be here to worry about it, right? 2058, you'll be here, that's about it. Other things going on as we get towards the end of the 1950s, we've got fire protection. Suwannee County finally institutes a countywide fire service. So one of the things they do is they start building these fire towers. There's the one off Highway 90 West, to be able to spot all those fires in our rural areas. And this starts basically in 1959. And so that goes on for many years. Of course, now forestry does a lot of that too. But we had a countywide fire service, watching over the timber. Other buildings being constructed and other things going on. Downtown Live Oak sees the completion of what was called Agricultural Office Building. We just needed more space. The courthouse was too small for all the various county departments, and some of them were state. Lots of different departments, so they decided to build this structure, this two-story building, on what had been the site of the old jail now, one that was built in the late 1800s/early 1900s. And so they built it, and it was completed, I believe, in 1958. But it had agriculture offices, but also had the school board, supervisor registration. And I have a whole list at my office of the various business, Veterans Affairs, and pretty much every ag-related office you could think of, both county and state, were in that building. Well, gradually even that was too small, and so they moved on to their own buildings, and this now houses the tax collector and property appraiser's office. So that is the courthouse right here, you can barely see. And that's the old jail here that was built in the 30s, late 30s. Which is now, of course, torn down. Well, as we get in the 1960s, something happens in 1960, international incident, U2 incident, or the Gary Powers incident. Basically, Francis Gary Powers, who was this guy, is flying a U2 spy plane over the Soviet Union. He is shot down. He survives, and parts of his plane are recovered also. He is captured by the Soviets and put on trial. It's an international incident. It blows up all over the place. Not literally, thankfully, but it is a big deal. The Soviet Union is upset, and we've been doing this for years. We've been flying over their territory for years, but finally they're able to do something about it, and they shoot it down with surface-to-air missiles. And so again, he is captured. He is sentenced. He is tried and sentenced to a gulag. Well, he eventually is released. But in the meantime, there's a lot of discussion about his poor wife, his family. His wife is Barbara Powers over here on the right. Barbara, it's interesting when I learned about this first, but she attended the trial for espionage. She was born in Live Oak in 1934, so she is from here. She lived here for a few years. Her dad worked for the railroad, for the Atlantic Coast Line. He was a telegrapher. So she lived here a few years. Her early years were spent here in Live Oak. She actually was born, let me see, I'm trying to remember. She was born pretty much close to Duval and Hamilton Streets. I think the old Viola House, I believe is what it's called. But she was born right there, pretty much across from where the fire station is today, and close to the John Hill Park. But she was born here, lived here for a few years, and then she moved on because her dad moved with the job. Well, Gary Powers is released after a lot of discussion. There was a movie that came out a few years ago, I haven't seen it, called Bridge of Spies. And basically he is traded for a Russian guy and lots of other stuff. It was an international deal. But after he was released, it wasn't too much longer that he decided to file for divorce from Barbara. He claimed that he had suffered more from her habitual intoxication, cursing, and abuse than he had from Soviet interrogation in prison. So, oops, not the best wife apparently. And so he divorces her and then remarries, I believe, one of the women who debriefed him after he got out of captivity. And they had a son, Francis Gary Powers Jr. And so when I did the research on this, when I found this in one of the newspaper articles several years ago now, probably 10 years ago now, I wrote an article in the newspaper on Francis Gary Powers and how it was tied into Suwannee County's history. Well, the son was searching and found that, so he contacted me. And so we talked back and forth, and he eventually agreed to come down and deliver presentations. So up until COVID, he was coming like once a year to do a presentation on his dad, the U-2 incident, the Cold War, spies, all that kind of stuff. So it was very interesting to do that. Now, because of COVID, he has not been back in a couple of years. He's talking to me about maybe coming next year, but we'll just have to see. Things have been off because of COVID, but that was very interesting. But I mean, as a historian and a military historian, loving it, I'd grown up hearing about that incident, and then to find out that there was a Live Oak connection was pretty funny. But she wasn't a nice person, apparently. 1962.
Yes, it wasn't.
Do what?
Did you say she wasn't a nice person? Or
She was not a very nice person, based on, from him anyway.
Yeah.
He'd rather have been in the, I suffered less in the prison and the interrogation. She was alcoholic and stuff like that, so, among other things, sounds like. She was very friendly with the guys, from what I've read. Anyway, 1962, an experimental low-level dam is built on the Swanee River, plus a boat lift to bring you up from the one part of the river to the other. It was built by the Swanee River Authority. It was just upriver from Swanee Springs. So this is a picture of it. And basically the idea of this was to be able to kind of keep the river high enough for fishing and such, but not to flood the surrounding area. So it was built in 1962, and in 1964 there was a letter to the county commission, and they said that it was a success and it's going to benefit farmers by providing a higher water table for the area. That was July of '64. However, by September of 1967, they're asking to tear it down. It's just not doing its job. Plus we have Hurricane Dora in between that. That doesn't help either. But the main thing is they have noticed that it's a hazard of navigation, because what does water do? It finds a way around. And you got lime rock. So it just eats away the lime rock, and so the river was just coming around on both sides. It was just flowing around. So it really wasn't doing any good at that point. So they tore it down. But you can go, I went there a few years ago because Swanee Springs, I go there a lot. And you can actually, if you go to the right spot, down where the boat ramp is, there are in the lime rock outcrops, you can see some of the metal from it that's still there. Still embedded after all these years. 1962 also sees First Federal Savings and Loan Association being founded under John Flood as the president. And it continues today, of course, with lots of offices, not just in Suwannee County and not just in Florida, mainly in Florida, but not just Florida, lots of different places. They moved the headquarters over to Lake City a few years ago. That was kind of upsetting because it started here, but they do what they do. Lots of different places. So this is the building as it pretty much stands today. We've been talking about building construction. Public building. We talked about that agricultural building that now houses the tax collector and property appraiser's office. And we still needed more space. And so in 1964, after a lot of years of discussion, the county commission finally decides to renovate the courthouse and then add to it. Now they were seriously considering before this of just tearing the courthouse down. Late 50s, early 1960s, let's just tear the building down and build a modern, nice modern structure. Well, eventually they decide, we'll renovate and then add on. So that begins in 1964. So they've got the original portion, the 1904 portion, which is that part you see there, the 2-story, and then they build a wraparound 1-story portion. We call it the 1964 edition because that's when it was approved. It was completed in 1965, and so that provided lots of space. Still not enough today, but at that time it provided a lot more space for the supervisor of elections, tax collector, property appraiser, sheriff's office, clerk of the court. So at this point, there's a small portion in that wing the sheriff's office has, and the front part is mainly the judges and judicial chambers and hearing rooms. We've got a couple of rooms up top for the clerk's office, but then most of the rest of the addition is the clerk's office at this point. We've just expanded because of our duties. We've got over 1,000 duties, by the way. So we need more people, and so over time, we have kind of taken it over. Even since I've been there for 25 years, we've taken over several of those office spaces. And it's still not enough. They keep talking about building a new courthouse or a new facility, not tear this one down, but a new facility somewhere else. One of the places we looked at 20 years ago, very seriously, was the parking lot behind the courthouse. Build a 4 or 5-story building. Well, after Debbie hit, we realized that was a good thing we didn't do it because there was a sinkhole there. So that's not going to ever happen now. But then they still talk about building different facilities. Well, as this is under construction, we've got something else that occurs in Suwannee County, and that would be something called Hurricane Dora. September 1964. It is our worst natural disaster up until that point. Now, since then, we've had Tropical Storm Debbie, and then just a couple weeks ago, we had Hurricane Dora. So those are going to be more expensive now. But at that time, it was the most expensive natural disaster here in the county. Lots of flooding, lots of flooding. This is downtown Live Oak, and you can see all the rain. If you were here when Debbie hit in 2012, you saw pretty much similar flooding to this. I think Debbie had even more inches of rain, but still lots of flooding. Even with updated irrigation methods and drainage methods between Dora and Debbie, you still got this kind of level of flooding. Lots of stuff. And unlike Debbie, there wasn't a sinkhole that opened up and sucked it all away in one day. So some of this flooding remained for a few days, several days. It was bad enough that the president, LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, addressed the county while flying over it. He addressed county officials via satellite. And then the water gradually receded, millions of dollars worth of damage, plus some of the buildings were damaged. And those of us who lived through through Tropical Storm Debbie understand kind of what kind of damage the flooding can do. After 2 weeks ago, we know what the wind can do. But this was downtown Live Oak. That's Howard Street, AKA US 90. Several feet deep at that point. That's a zoomed in picture of downtown. This is Highway 90. There's the courthouse with the addition being under construction. So lots of flooding, lots of flooding. There's the Armory right there. That was the old Armory at that point. One that was built in the 30s. So that's a good picture of it there. This was the inside of First National Bank, which is now Hal Air's office. Lots of damage, lots of damage. That's another photograph on 129 North, one of the old Kent's meat markets and such, which is, that building's still there. It's funny because when Debbie hit, I went down to that same location and took a picture of it. Just to compare, and I should have put it in here, but at that time in 2012, whatever the sign was, you could see the top part of it, and it was something about had enough yet, and it was just funny because there's the water right there below it too, so that building's still there. It's a secondhand, it's the flea market there. One of the issues, which I'll talk more about next month, Lord willing, this downtown flooding. Right here is the high school, the Metcalf School, built in 1928. This flooding messes up the foundation. And so after Dora, schools have to shift all over the place. And we'll talk more about it next month, but I just want to give you a heads up on it because there was some major damage. So they had to abandon that school, use the Armory, the Pineview School. That's when the Pineview School pretty much started shifting to the high school, different stuff like that. It was a mess. It was a mess. So we end with Hurricane Dora. Eventually, there we go. And so next month, Lord willing, we will start at the end of Hurricane Dora and then move on through the 1970s. So we're getting closer to the modern day. And then after we get done with up to current day, then we're going to start doing topical discussions. So this is presentation number, 15 maybe? And we've got 36 total. So after we finish this in a couple months, 3 months, it's going to be topical. Things like military history, railroads, various communities. We'll focus on just those things. So that's today's lesson. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Appreciate y'all being here.